Hi, good morning, everybody. Just briefly before I start, are there still people without tutorial groups now? Can I see hands? 1, 2, 3. So you have registered. You've got confirmation of your registration. Okay. After the lecture, can you come down here and we'll place you in one of the groups? As far as I know now, I've received a class list from SAS, so the Flexi School is completely full. So anybody who wants to register still now, you can't, it's full. So we can't take more than 50 students in the tutorials. We just can't cope with it otherwise, and it's going to affect your learning because you won't be able to discuss things anymore. So we have to cap at 300. So those students who were lucky enough to register on time, please come down and we'll put you in the tutorial groups that still have a space. We should have exactly, 1 or 2 spaces in some tutorials because we organized the course for 300. I hope that everything else is kind of coming along. I hope today that I can create a resource page that should be available either Monday or Tuesday next week, so you have access online to the literature and a study schedule. But it's going to look different from the normal Moodle page because we won't have time to create one. So but it makes things easier. Today I'm going to be talking, it's the last lecture of Unit 1. So for those who registered quite late, there is a number of you. It's important to catch up with the readings because you kind of have to think about this whole week is the equivalent of 4 weeks in the normal course. So every week of the regular UU204 has 2 readings a week, so now we have 2 readings every day. So there is some catching up to do. The multiple choice test is next week on Friday. I haven't had confirmation yet of a larger venue than this, but please make sure that you're here. We're going to give you 2 hours for the multiple choice test. I doubt you need 2 hours. But we'll just make sure that we have a venue for 2 hours. So you'll hear the location of that next week. But you have to make sure that you're here. It's from 10 to 12. Because we can't do it online, we can't create it on time. And the existing multiple choice test online has disappeared. So we have to do it all together at the same time during the lecture. So please make sure you're here. We can't make allowances for people who decide to be somewhere else, want to travel, etc., etc. Because we can't. It's a lot of work to create multiple choice tests, and we can't create different ones for different people. The Flexi School, you need to be here every day. It's an oversubscribed course. We're trying our best to cram 14 weeks into 4, with 1 extra week to finalize your assignments. So we really can't make any exceptions when it comes to the timeline. It's very strict and it requires for you to work every day. And it's only that way that we can manage to do it within this time frame. So take that into consideration. If you haven't had access to materials yet, or you've registered late, you haven't met your tutor yet, please do so today. Explain your situation. Ask them to copy either the readings on your laptop, or if you have a USB, ask them to copy it on that, or come to my office and I'll copy the reading material on your USB so that you can get started. That's very important if you're behind. So today's lecture is on settler communities and recent migration in and out. It's the end of Unit 1 where we have discussed migration patterns, the wayfinding, the first kind of settlers in the region, how they've spread through the region, the wayfinding with canoes, Lapita. Today we're going to talk about migration in and out over quite a large period of time, 1800s to now. So I hope that it's not too overwhelming, the content of this lecture, because it's a lot. So we're talking about multiple forms of migration in and out by multiple ethnicities in different times, in different places in the Pacific. But we're the issues that come up when you discuss migration are quite similar. So that's why we've put it all in this topic. I'm going to give some examples of migrant groups in the Pacific into it and some out. But as some of you might have done the readings for today, it's very complex. There is such a huge variety of groups coming in and migrating out over such a large space that, you know, it's good for you to get an idea of it. That's why we've given you the reading. But of course, you can't memorize them all. We're not asking you to. We're not going to ask you, you know, what kind of ethnicities have migrated to Samoa in a specific period of time. We've given you the reading because we want you to have an awareness of it, the complexities of it. Because if you grow up in Fiji or in Vanuatu or Samoa, wherever it is in the Pacific, you're familiar with specific groups of migrants coming in. You know, Chinese restaurants, Koreans, in Fiji, Indo-Fijians. And we want you to be aware of the multitude of groups and migration waves in the Pacific as a region. So that's why we've given you a quite dense, long reading that gives you an overview of all these different migration waves. But of course, we're not asking you to memorize them. So you need to kind of, your attitude towards the readings of this week is really of this unit, today, the topic is really to kind of have an understanding of the complexity of migration waves throughout time in the Pacific region and the in and out migration. So before people get stressed, you know, that the article is long with lots of facts and you're going to have to memorize it all, you don't. So the learning outcomes are discuss the history of the settler communities in the Pacific region. So again, it's an awareness. We want you to be able to come up with an example, so that you have a good overview. Discuss knowledge pertaining to recent migrants in and out of the Pacific region. So again, we just want you to be able to discuss issues in relation to it and come with examples. You don't have to know all of them. So key concepts are migration, settler communities, Gurmit, and these, you need to be able to explain what these terms are. Migrants are people who move to other countries, often temporarily. I'm a migrant here in Fiji. Although I'm married to it, I'm here, you know, to work at USB. I'm not intending to be here forever, so I'm a typical migrant. Very often you come for economic and political reasons. I didn't. I came out of a more cultural reason. I wanted my son to grow up here. So migrants have various reasons. But you know, you tend to generalize when you talk about migration patterns because there are so many similarities. Very often the majority of migrants who come into the Pacific come here for jobs, to earn a better living, to be able to provide for their families. They also come here because of conflicts in their home countries. Vietnamese came into the Pacific because of the war in Vietnam. So there are all kinds of reasons. And very often when the political problems cease, people move back to their home countries. But of course some stay because they've entered into relationships with people in the country where they've lived as a migrant for several years. Now, settlers are people who migrate really to migrate somewhere and stay permanently, to settle. That's why they're called settlers. And when you talk about settler communities, it is when a large group of the same ethnicity comes and they form a community, a permanent community within the country that they settle in. So when you think about the Gurmit, for example, the Indo-Fijians who came to settle in Fiji, they are a settler community. So Gurmit, we often get questions, what does the name mean? You're gonna watch a video today in your tutorials that give a very detailed overview of the arrival and the lives here and reasons for Indo-Indians coming here. So I'm not gonna get into it with too much detail, but the term Gurmit is based on the word agreement. These Indians signed agreements to come and work in Fiji When they arrived, they realized they didn't earn enough money to ever come back. They were stuck. Working conditions were very different from what they expected, but they signed an agreement when they came. So this is why it's referred to as gurmits. So there are many challenges as a result of migration patterns in and out within the Pacific. And one of them, of course, is that you're starting to get a multicultural society. And not everybody is understanding of the growth of multicultural societies. Very often it's considered a threat to your identity, to your lifestyle, when large groups come in and live their lifestyle. And so even though it can be an enriching thing, you know, you can eat different kinds of foods, you can learn about other cultural practices, it also has a lot of challenges that come with it. So I want to show a video because we always, you know, there are tensions here in Fiji. I'm trying to, with the preparation of this lecture, I don't want it to be too political, and I don't want to be negative about any migrant groups. Because it's a very sensitive topic. I realized that when I was preparing this last night. So what I'm trying to do is to give you an idea of the challenges in relation to migration. Pacific migrants within the Pacific, they face challenges and discrimination. Chinese, Indians, Vietnamese, Koreans face discrimination as migrants in the Pacific region. Pacific migrants who migrate out face discrimination and all kinds of problems. So it's a widespread thing, and I'm trying to give you an overview of this because I know it's you know, there's discrimination back and forth. It's not just one way, and the migrants are the victims because they're misunderstood, and misunderstanding often leads to anger, resentment, judgments, you know, they're stealing our jobs, etc., etc. So this is a film that illustrates that it happens amongst Pacific Islanders too, who migrate in the Pacific. I'm going to try and up the volume. How do I do that? Volume. Huh. Yeah, that's the computer. Is there a... George, do you have any idea how I can increase the volume? Sorry, it's really low here. Yeah, you need to be able to hear it. No, it's already max. It's already max. And now you can't hear it at all. Right, great. I thought something like this would happen. Is it? You can't hear it, huh? Right, okay, that's no point then, because you guys can't hear this. I can hear it, but you can't, huh? Okay, so we'll give you the links to these videos and have a look. It's really to illustrate that Micronesians who have migrated to Hawaii are being discriminated by Hawaiians. And they are very surprised by it because they thought they would be welcomed because they're fellow Pacific Islanders. So there's an illustration that, you know, discrimination of migrants happens between all kinds of ethnicities. There is an inherent kind of challenge when you think about migrants coming in and groups are growing. There is a tendency when the economy kind of deteriorates, people start to discriminate because they're stealing their jobs or they want to have different lifestyles, they do different cultural events, etc. And because of misunderstanding, you start to get derogatory terms that are being used to refer to them. So it's widespread. It's not just migrants coming from Asia in, but it's also Pacific Islanders migrating within the region. So the Pacific multicultural societies that are growing as a result of migration is a challenge. There is declining populations as a result of migration out, which impacts village and social organization. This is a huge problem in Niue, for example, in the Cook Islands. There's too many people have migrated out, and it affects the ability for people to work on the land and have a kind of organized village structure. There is a high dependence on remittances, which makes you very vulnerable, because when the remittances stop, how are you gonna get the money that you need for the lifestyles, for events, for schools that you need? There's a brain drain in the Pacific, people who get education overseas and come back temporarily and then move overseas again for various reasons, which leads to a brain drain in the Pacific Islands. So the primary motive in general is economic improvement for migrants and their families, although political and environmental changes and cultural considerations also affect these flows. So for me, for example, it's a cultural consideration. I want my son to learn about Fijian culture and get to know his family. There can be environmental reasons, such as people with climate change having to migrate because of sea level rises, etc. So when you think about Pacific mobility and migration in and out, there is migration into the Pacific from China, Korea, the Philippines. There's inter-island mobility, and this increased after Europeans arrived in the mid-1800s and entered the Pacific and colonized throughout the region except for Tonga. The colonial period created a lot of work opportunities, which led to migrants coming in, you know, such as the Indians who came to work on the sugar plantations. And there are many examples. This is also how many Chinese came in to work in Hawaii. So there are settler communities, and people settled because they came for a long time, formed communities and stayed. Decolonization began in 1962. Western Samoa became independent, and it's after decolonization that you started to get migration out and in, different flows. So people, based on their colonial past, could now migrate out to the countries that colonized them. People could come in. Different arrangements after independence were made between countries in Asia to get workers in for jobs that the indigenous Pacific Islanders didn't want to do, or were not considered suitable for, or there was no interest, or they were more expensive than the labor from Asia. There is out-migration in the post-Second World War era, characterized by migration that is dependent on the colonial history. So migration to the USA, New Zealand, the UK. And there is migration inwards that is determined by political and economic factors. So migration inwards is largely from the Asian continent, and it's influenced by economy, colonialism, and politics. So a few examples are, in American Samoa, you have migrants that have come in from China. There are Filipinos, Indonesians, and Koreans. In the Cook Islands, you have Chinese migrants, Filipino, and Indians. In Fiji, you have Chinese, Filipinos, Indians, Indonesians. In Kiribati, you have Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Indians, and Filipinos. You know, the list can go on, as you may know from the reading of today. And I had another video to show you an explanation of the early history of Chinese in Hawaii, because they were the first migrants from the Asian country coming in, and it started in Hawaii. And as you probably all know, they're everywhere now in the Pacific. So it's interesting to see where that all started and challenges that they faced. But again, I'll give you the link, and then you can watch it either in the tutorial or in your free time if you want some more information on this. So migration outwards. There's more migration outwards from Polynesia and increasingly Micronesia. And there's more migration out from those areas than Melanesia. And it's to Pacific Rim countries, the US and the UK. And nobody really knows exactly why. In Fiji, interestingly, also, there's more migration from the western side than the eastern sides. But again, nobody has been able to explain exactly why that is. There are in parts of Polynesia more people living overseas than in the country itself. And nations like Niue and the Cook Islands have declining populations. And larger states such as Tonga and Samoa continue to experience a very limited population growth as immigration outwards has become kind of a safety valve. You know, the remittances for the family has become a safety thing for your family to manage financially. So as a result, they're also slow growing economies. So when you think about migration from an indigenous Pacific Islander approach, and it's important to make this distinction, I can't say enough about the motivations and the organizations of migrants coming in from Asia. This is very complex material. I've done research on Fijian migrants going to the UK, and I know their motivations and why they live lifestyles that they do. I cannot tell you enough about Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, etc. So what I decided to do is to give you kind of a general overview, and the readings give that as well. And I'm going to continue now to give you a better view of motivations for indigenous Pacific Islanders migrating out. There is a strong difference in motivations that are very cultural, and I can only say something for Pacific Islanders, but not for Chinese or Filipinos. So we're going to continue now with an indigenous Pacific Islander interpretation of migration out. And it's very important in that you recognize migration as a social-cultural act, not simply economical. So Pacific migration needs to be re-theorized. They don't just migrate for economic gain, but they send remittances to the family home, and you have all these statistics with this is how much money comes in, and this is what families do with it. But it's purely looking at the economics and the money, not at the motivations for sending money back. And this is crucial. So for most Pacific migrants, the very process of migration is motivated in part by desire or a sense of obligation to support their kin, their family, their vanua, in the homeland. So in a way, what we also call transnationalism, the moving out, is perceived as an inherent element of migration. And transnationalism is a term that indicates that connections are not lost. People migrate out, but the connections to the homeland stay. So that's why it's transnationalism, a kind of nationalism across borders. Migration of indigenous Pacific Islanders is rarely an individual decision to meet personal individual goals. Individualism is anyway in the Pacific a term that doesn't really apply. When you talk about indigenous Pacific Islanders especially, you're part of many. You're a representative of a whole clan or a place. So you don't think about yourself as just one. There's, many of you kind of invisibly behind you. So that's already a problem as well when you think about Western analysis of migration. So migration decisions are usually shaped within the family. Sometimes it's decided who should migrate because that's a reliable person who will send money back, and the whole family joins in to support that person with the visa and the flight. So those who migrate are expected to support kin. You're not expected to just move and, you know, live an exciting lifestyle and come back when you feel like it. Migration is directed at improving both the living standards of those who remain at home and the lifestyle and income of the person migrating. So reasons for migration and the sending of remittances. It's not just to send money home for school fees. It's for land rights, support plans for retirement, status building, but ultimately to ensure that your family can fulfill their kinship obligations, their contributions. So it's really a form of a means to sustain a Samoan, a Fijian, or a Tongan lifestyle. I mean, you can generalize this further in the Pacific. So in this globalizing world, when money is becoming more important, you need money for specific ceremonial events. The presentation of Mets and Tambua and Yangona is not enough. There's money involved. So it's really now becoming a means to fulfill these kinship obligations. So there's a close connection between kinship, society, and migration. And my research with Fijian migrants in the UK indicates that kinship is crucial to understand Pacific migration and the lifestyle of Pacific migrants overseas. So I know that Fijians in the UK do the utmost, although it varies per generation, to sustain a Fijian lifestyle. I know the same of some Tongans and Cook Islanders and people from Niue and Tonga in New Zealand and Australia. There's a very much effort is made to do particular ceremonial events, to come together, to have money-raising events, etc. And very often it's more easy to not do it, but they make a point of doing it. And my research was asking the question, why is that? So the case study that I worked on amongst Fijian migrants in the UK, these were migrants who came quite recently to the UK, 2000, in the 90s. My husband was part of that. The first Fijian migrants came in 1962. There were only 212 of them. They were asked to join the British Army after Army personnel from the British Army went to the best schools in Fiji and selected young boys. And they signed up. It was a status thing. It was good. It was exciting. Joining the British Army when the Queen was still considered the highest chief in Fiji was the ultimate thing that you could do as a young boy. But because they were quite small in number, when they arrived in the UK, they quickly were spread out to settle at different army bases. So they were forced to really integrate into British society. They didn't even know where everybody was going to. Once they arrived, they were all put in buses and they went. That was a different situation with the British Army soldiers from Fiji who arrive there now. They tend to be put in army bases, you know, where other Fijians are. They work very well together. That's recognized in the British Army now. So that causes them to be able to have a lot of communal events. So you get a kind of Fijian village idea at army barracks. Currently there are about 2,500 Fijians serving in the British Army. They closed the registration of Fijians in the army and they're going to open it again next year. So there'll be more coming in. There are some other Fijian migrants working as nurses. There are some rugby players. There are some who work on the rail tracks. Those are ex-soldiers very often. So when you think about the population size in the UK and the number of these Fijians, it's not huge, but because they are concentrated in specific locations, they all live together, and that enables them to form very tight-knit communities. So a Fijian lifestyle, I mean, many of you know, but some of you are not from here, is also known as living a life in the manner of the land, the vanua. It's Fijian life is according to the land waka vanua, according to the chiefs waka turanga, according to kinship waka wk1, and according to the church waka lotu. And these are important elements to remember when you think about the ways in which migrants overseas try to sustain this lifestyle. So these are pictures that I took of my research. So you have formal, proper welcomes when people from government or the church come to the UK. The community, wherever they arrive, will welcome them formally with a presentation of a whale's tooth and yangona, and they sit on mats and masi, and the whole community is there. First birthdays are celebrated in a way that is very similar to Fiji. They try to make it as Fijian as possible. So they go through great lengths to have the masi, the mats, Fijian dresses, etc., and everybody comes. This is my son and my husband. When we came back to somebody's house for the first time, he was presented with masi and gifts, so very similar to what would happen here in Fiji. There are Fijian church services in Fijian, although they're thinking now about changing it into English so that the children can follow the services. It's a hard decision because I don't really want to let go of the Fijian aspect of it, so that's under discussion at the moment. There are many money-raising events for people in Fiji, for people in the UK who want to apply for passports. There's so many that is actually a great burden, and you have to make choices where to go or not, but you have to also be careful that you go to enough to not be considered somebody who is not contributing to the community enough. So the pressures that you face here in Fiji when you have to consider where to go, what to contribute, are the same in the UK, but it's double up because you then have the community obligations in the UK, but also to your family, your vanua at home. So it's quite stressful. And here you can see a typical money-raising event in the UK. So you would have a table with all the food, and there's usually a pot or a box, and you put your money in there. And it's recorded what you put in there. It seems like it's anonymous, but it's not. So people also record, like in Fiji, when you present things, what is that person giving, how much should they get in return, how much food can they take home, etc. So there's a lot of eating together, and these are important events for young children to learn about Fijian ways of living. Because, you know, everybody in the UK has dining tables, chairs, TVs, the layout of the house is different from here. So these are opportunities for children to learn how to behave when you're at communal events. You know, where to sit, how to walk, to say too low, how to eat, when to eat, what to do with your plates, etc., etc. They're small things, but they're very important because it enables them to feel comfortable with their family when they visit in Fiji. So living the Fijian way is understood as crucial for sustaining their relation with the vanua. And thereby the vanua itself is comprehending as it does relations between land and sea, people and chiefs. They need to sustain these while they are overseas. And they go to great lengths to make sure this is the case. Not sustaining this is something that can cause them to be disconnected from their vanua. And as Tuwere has written, and you'll read this later on in the course, to be cast out from your vanua is to be cut off from your source of life. So when you're overseas, there is even more pressure to sustain that relationship. And there are fears that if you don't do that, you will get ill, even in the UK. Your children may have misfortune, you may have misfortune. Ancestors might get angry and start banging on your roof in the UK. There are these real fears. So Fijian migration is a means of earning money, but giving this as an explanation for migration is too simple. Migration is motivated by economic prosperity, education, sending money and goods back to Fiji is important, but especially to mediate kinship and thereby stay connected to the Vanua. So Fijian migration, from my understanding, is a means to live traditional lives in the manner of the land in a growing, globalizing world. By migrating out, you help your family and your Vanua by living a sustainable life in a globalizing world, by being able to fulfill your money obligations, etc. So this is not only the case for Fijians. There is work on the Samoan diaspora. Diaspora is a word that is often used to refer to people moving out of their home countries somewhere else. So you have a Samoan diaspora, you have a Tongan one, you have a Fijian one, etc. I cannot pronounce this name, so I'm just going to use Lailo Mayava Doctor to refer to her literature. But this article illustrates that Samoans understand migration or their mobility as a culturally informed, historically grounded response to modernity and globalization. So the fact that she says historically grounded is because, as we've discussed with wayfinding and migration into the region, Pacific Islanders have always traveled for new lives, new lands, new opportunities. So you can see it within that same frame. It's something that is inherent in Pacific Islanders. However, like Fijians, Samoans are under a lot of pressure to fulfill their obligations back home. So when you think about Samoans moving, Fijians moving, Tongans moving, they're under a lot of stress to fulfill kinship obligations. They lose ties, you know, with their culture, especially their children, which is very difficult when you come back home and your children feel uncomfortable, don't understand your grandmother. They're made fun of because they have a strange accent, etc. These are difficult things. So there is a cost of being a migrant in and out of the Pacific. Not just a financial one, but a cultural one, a personal one. So migrants pay a price that is not simply financial. So there is you can look at the costs versus benefits of out-migration. So costs would be, there are psychological effects to migrating out. You're away from your family, you're away from elders who can give you advice, who can guide you. You're simply away from your homeland, which can be difficult for many, and some find it easier. You're dealing with loss of culture because you're not present at many events. You start to integrate in the country where you're in and the lifestyle, which means that you're finding it more difficult to come back home and adjust in that lifestyle. There's a cost for recipient states. You know, people are leaving. It means that there can be a brain drain. Certain people not being in the community to fulfill specific roles. Benefits are that, you know, there are educational opportunities, there are job opportunities, which leads to remittances. So these are artworks that show the stress that migrants are under. This is Andi Lele Siuao. I find it hard to pronounce these things. But they're very powerful visual images of the stresses of migrants. Very often I hear in Fiji, you know, the brothers who moved overseas to join the army or work at the rail tracks, you know, they're millionaires. They have such a fantastic lifestyle. They look like that when they come back. They save up all their money. They want to, you know, give gifts to everybody, take them out for dinner, to bars, to the cinema, because they know what life is like in Fiji. And because they then earn money, they want to come home and treat everybody. On top of that, of course, they have all the family obligations that they have to fulfill. So it's no wonder that people here think, oh, life is great overseas. They're millionaires. They live in fancy houses. Reality is more often than not very different. They do have very often the lower paid jobs, have to work multiple jobs, send a lot of money back home, are struggling financially as a result in the country that they've migrated to. So here you can see the painting, the blue color stands for blue collar job, which is the lower paid jobs. White color is the more executive jobs. And it shows that they're not happy because this is what they're stuck into when they migrate overseas. The other image, this one, you can see the power socket on the head, which indicates, you know, I migrate overseas and, you know, I just put the power socket in me and I'll do my menial jobs or the factory jobs that they often end into. So it's far from pleasant and people miss the environment at home. Here you can see a very powerful one. It indicates the pressures that Pacific migrants are under to fulfill all their obligations in the country that they migrated to and back home. So this is relief tied to a tree. So you can interpret yourself what that means. So I haven't just related this to migration. This is actually, these are artworks that are specifically made to express the situation specific migrants face when they move overseas. Here you have another one called Being Caught in Two Cultures. So here you see again the blue color of the blue collar jobs that many migrants have. The person is looking in the mirror and here you can see Pacific motifs. There is a kind of being caught in the blue collar job and your Pacific heritage, your identity, and being faced now with both and being caught in it. You have to live one to be accepted in the country where you've migrated to, but you want to retain the other one to remain part of your home country, your family, your vanua. So I hope that with these visual images, you know, it kind of explains the situation of Pacific migrants that the majority faces. I also chose the artworks because Pacific art is an inherent part of Pacific cultures. There are ways of educating, communicating stories, and that's why, even though this is contemporary, this is not traditional Pacific art, it still has the same means. You know, it's still a way of communicating the stresses and strains that Pacific migrants go through art. So they're not telling about migration stories or landings or rivalries between ancestral gods. They're telling you something else. And you know, as we go through this course, we have an assignment at the end, Matai, which is a creative assignment that you can choose instead of your essay. And we have incorporated Matai because of the integral role of Pacific arts as a means to communicate, to tell stories, to educate, to share, to inform. This is a starter, and I'll give more examples throughout the course, to think about how you can use art to address all kinds of topics of this course, and maybe give you ideas as well for your Matai assignments. Now, the last thing that I want to say is when you think about contemporary migration patterns, and again, I'm referring to Pacific Islander migration patterns, are they different from past migration patterns? So when we go back to Epeli Hau'ofa, we can say that Pacific people have always traveled, and these movements should be understood as paths along which people can travel back and forth. So the links are not broken. You know, the paths are created. And when I think about Fijian Itoke society, when women traditionally move to their husband's village, they create paths, new paths along which goods go back and forth. And the same can be said for Pacific migrants moving out of their home country. New paths are created. They're not broken. And that's also why the term transnationalism is so important. The relations remain. So the foundation for almost all travel in the past has been and still is kinship. So in the past it would be finding, you know, new suitable marriage partners, creating exchange, but everybody is related ultimately in the Pacific. So when you think about current migration patterns, there's also an element of kinship there. You need to fulfill, you're helping your family to fulfill their kinship obligations. You're sustaining your connections with the Vanua, founded on kinship relations. And the same can be said for Samoan and Tongan migration. So it's important to realize that when I talked earlier in the lecture, we discussed migrants coming in. This interpretation of migration out of indigenous Pacific Islanders does not apply to them. You know, you have to be sure that when you analyze migration patterns, you make sure that you analyze it from the proper cultural perspective. So because I know more about indigenous Pacific Islanders, ways of thinking and motivations for migration, I've addressed it in more detail. But you can do more research on Chinese migrants coming in, Filipinos, Vietnamese, if you're interested, and see what their motivations were and how they've experienced their encounters here in the Pacific. So when you think about migrants coming in, again, can you think about them as Oceanians? Or would you not? Are they Pacific Islanders? These categories of belonging or being from are again very important when you think about the challenges of migrations in and out within the region. The challenges of the multicultural society. So that's where I want to kind of leave you with. Again, in the tutorial, you're gonna watch a film, the Gurmit, so that aspect of settler communities with a focus on Fiji is gonna be discussed in great detail as well. And those who do not have tutorial groups, come down so we can put you in one. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on Monday next week.